Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the 27th webinar in our Pandemics and Societies series. Today's webinar topic is Protecting Vaccine Integrity and Preparing for the Big One, a conversation with Michael Osterholm. I'll now pass it to our moderator, Jennifer Nuzzo, the director of the Pandemic Center and a professor of epidemiology at the Brown University School of Public Health. Jennifer?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion today. There has been a tremendous amount of upheaval in U.S. public health. The Trump administration is making major changes to federal health agencies, the independent expert groups that advise those agencies, and key health policies, and particularly around vaccines. And recently, we saw the meeting of the new members of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, better known as ACIP. So the first meeting of a completely reconstituted ACIP, who weighed in on several issues pertaining to vaccines such as MMRV, hepatitis B, and COVID-19. And the decisions of this group shape national vaccine policy. And there's been a lot of shifts in strategy around that coming out of HHS and CDC. So a lot to pay close attention to. And amidst all this change, there's a lot of things to unpack and to understand, not just what is happening, but also what it will mean for the future. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to try to understand these changes and then also talk about the future and what's at stake here. And so fortunately, I am joined today by really our top expert who's been leading on these issues for a really long time. We have with us today Dr. Michael Osterholm, who's the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, sometimes shortened as CIDRAP, or at least some of us call it CIDRAP. Mike has really been instrumental in so many things, but one of the things I want him to talk about is a recent initiative, which is the Vaccine Integrity Project. So hopefully he'll be able to explain a bit about that group and its purpose and work. And Mike also is the author of several New York Times bestselling books, but his new book is called The Big One: How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. Mike has always been an important voice in terms of not just understanding the consequences of what's happening now, but what's at stake for the future. And this book is no exception to that. It's really an unflinching assessment of how the US and global health agencies handled COVID-19, and it is a call to action on what must change before the next pandemic arrives. And clearly, the next pandemic will arrive. And so we need to talk about what needs to be done. So we're thrilled to have him with us today. And with that, Mike, thank you. Thank you for joining us. First of all, maybe we could just start with your giving us a bit of background on the Vaccine Integrity Project. What is it? Why'd you start it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jennifer, for having me, and to your entire center. I feel kind of like it's the old band's back together again here with this day. You, Beth Cameron, Wilmot James, and the team are all also major leaders in this effort to deal with the immediate public health problems, but also our long-term challenges that we have with things like the next pandemic or even a bioterrorism event. And so I really admire the work you're doing. I appreciate it very much. And again, I'm really honored to be here with you today. So let me just add a preface to the comments I'm going to make today, because I think it's very important to understand where people come from when they're making comments about the current events. You know, I've had a role in every presidential administration dating back to Ronald Reagan, where I participated actively and supported the HIV/AIDS Commission. Even in Trump 1, I served as a science envoy for the State Department, traveling around the world in 2017 and 18 to help us be better prepared for a pandemic. So I don't think I was all that successful, obviously, by the proof in the pudding. And of course, as you know, I was on the Biden-Harris transition team on COVID. And I also, for 25 of the 50 years I've been in Minnesota, I actually was at the state health department and the university combined at the same time. And I served two Democratic governors, two Republican governors, and as we affectionately say in Minnesota, many won't remember Jesse Ventura, the wrestler, but he also as one of the governors. And no one could tell you my partisan politics. I am just a soldier in the public health response team, and that's my job. And today I will do everything I can just to call balls and strikes. So hopefully my comments can be taken as such. Having said that, and in reference to your question, on the night of the election, after it was apparent that Mr. Trump had won, and realizing what had happened just before the election in terms of his relationship with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I realized we were in for some big trouble. I actually pulled out the 2025 document and looked at those parts that dealt with public health and thought, oh my God, this is our future. I wrote an email the following morning to our staff at CIDRAP, and I'm getting to be an old man and people are expecting me to move on here pretty soon. And I said, I'm definitely signing up for 4 more years. I'm in. This is going to be challenging. 2 weeks later, I wrote a op-ed piece in the New York Times with Zeke Emanuel, in which I laid out why I was very certain that we are going to see the demise of basically public health as we knew it, and that in fact, Mr. Kennedy, if he were in fact confirmed as Secretary of Health and Human Services, would take our vaccines away from us. And I have to admit, I was a little surprised at the time because that piece was actually met with some resistance from some colleagues saying, oh, you've gone too far here. This is not going to happen. I don't think people had the kind of creative imagination that they should have and could have had to understand what was coming. And I would actually say, even at this very day, I don't think we yet fully understand the potential future, yet to be realized impact that's going to happen with public health and vaccines. So it was that I had discussions with a number of colleagues about what could we do if in fact CDC were compromised, and in specifics the ACIP, Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And in April, I approached Christy Walton, who has a foundation that has helped support CIDRAP in the past, and she agreed to provide us support to get together a group to look at this very issue. And Jennifer, you participated in this, I know. We had 6 different focus groups that met over the course of several weeks, ranging in everything from basic R&D all the way up to vaccine delivery, the entire vaccine enterprise. And we identified 8 different areas that we could really see major compromise in if, in fact, as I say, CDC is gutted in credibility and that ACIP was full dismissal would occur, all of which then eventually happened. And at that point, we identified then what were 3 of the pillars of this 8-pillar kind of picture. And first and foremost was, well, we have the fall vaccine season coming up. We have our viral pathogen vaccines in COVID, influenza, and RSV. And who is going to make the recommendations for those? Because clearly it was not going to come from this administration or from CDC or ACIP, at least in a believable way. And so we embarked upon doing a protocol review, a registered protocol with NIH, where we actually did a very similar kind of evaluative process as ACIP would do. Mind you, we are not ACIP. We can never be ACIP. They are unique in the government status that they own and the workforce that they have, so that they obviously will always be the gold standard if they're allowed to function without the political constraints that we now know are there. We did that so that our data would be available to the medical societies, which have always also made recommendations for vaccines over the years. This is not new this year. What's new is that rather than follow the ACIP recommendations, which quite honestly, most of us can't even tell you what they are because they seem to change by the latest video or Instagram kind of comment. And so that we put this together, and we had 26 individuals from around the country, including our then staff at CIDRAP, and literally worked, I would say, since early July, about 20 hours a day, going through over 1,700 abstracts of information, doing the kind of review and due diligence, the bias assessment, et cetera, that you would expect to see from a full type of review. We first summarized those data about a month and a half ago, concentrating first on children and pregnant women as it relates to the organizations AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as ACOG, OBGYNs and pregnant women. And we presented those data to them so that they could use that for their own decision making about what vaccines to recommend and how to recommend them. The data included was everything that had been published or referenced since the time of the last ACIP review, meaning the old ACIP. We have now just finishing completing all of the review for those 3 vaccines are being used by a number of the medical societies now to base their recommendations. One of the things that we were hopeful is that by providing that kind of information, also the payers would see this is an alternative but legitimate source of scientific information to be able to justify we will cover vaccines even if in fact the ACIP does not recommend them, and how that would play out for many in this country who couldn't afford a vaccine or may in some cases even have access to a vaccine if in fact AHIP did not agree with the payment for those. And so that's really where we're at now. We'll be putting our information out very shortly. We'll be publishing in a major medical journal, and we are actually going to be distributing very shortly an app that will actually allow you to have access to all the data we had, all those papers I talked about, all the analysis. That'll be available for anyone to go in and do their own decision making around that. And we will continue to do that going forward with additional vaccines. We're looking at right now what should be the priority ones that we are looking at. And we're going to continue to do this till the CDC and ACIP are restored back to their scientific excellence. I can't wait until the day that that happens. We're out of a job that way. That's our goal. And we'll do that. Just quickly, let me add two last pieces. We also at CIDRAP have taken on the mis and disinformation issue. And in fact, we are assembling a major effort in our center right now. We actually have an RFP out for this to assist us with this very activity. And we all know that today, in any one given news hour, God knows what can come forward from the administration proclaiming one or another conclusions for which there may be little to no scientific fact to support that. And we need to be able to be in a position where we can react quickly, we act with authority, and be able to explain what some of this disinformation is about, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and allow hopefully the public as well as particularly the media and others to have a source of credible information. The final piece that we're going to put together, the third leg that we're taking on, is just trying to help with collaboration. We've had extensive discussions with the societies. In fact, we've met with some of them almost on a weekly basis through the development of our work. In addition, there's the regional state groups that are come together now, the Northeast, the Northwest. And one of the things that we hope we can help with is more of a collaboration where we harmonize what's happening. There's nothing worse right now than to have 20 different recommendations for the same vaccine in 20 different locations or different groups. In fact, that makes it much harder for the public to understand, but it also makes it very difficult in some cases for the payers to decide, are we going to cover all of these different new approaches or not? And so we're hopeful that we can help that way. Again, we're not the convener. We're not the ones to, say, hey, we're in charge. Come on, everybody, follow the charge. But how can we help bring people together so that we aren't duplicating efforts that, in fact, don't need duplication, and we're covering activities and areas that need to be done. So that's a long-winded answer, Jennifer. I'm sorry, but it kind of gives you the sense of where we're at right now. And all I can say is we're in this for the long haul.
Thank you for all of that. Thank you for your efforts. And crucially, thank you for your opening framing context, which is that you have been someone who's been leading on these issues throughout multiple administrations. I have seen you do this, and I have seen you engage, and I have never seen a partisan element. And truthfully, these matters had never been partisan before. These matters had been something that involved support on both sides of the aisle, because the future of the country is at stake here. This is not just about our American health, but also our national security. And there has always been a deep interest in making sure the United States is as prepared as it could be. And so I think what we're seeing now is really a radical departure of all that. And the fact that we have to kind of frame the context of these remarks by saying, this is not a partisan conversation, I really think kind of underscores what's gone off the rails a bit on this. In terms of the Vaccine Integrity Project, I was, first of all, happy to see there was like a front page feature, at least on the front page of the website of the Wall Street Journal, about your effort. And one of the things I was also happy to see you're quoted to say, listen, we're doing this, I'm paraphrasing you here, but we're doing this work, but this does not replace a functioning ACIP or functioning federal health agencies. And I think that context is really important. I think the work that you're doing, I think was always going to be important, regardless of what was happening with ACIP. I think having independent expert voices outside of government to say, yes, we've looked at it too, and that we agree, that I think is an important role to play, but it doesn't negate a functioning federal process. And I just really want to thank you for making that point, because I think people are sort of looking at, well, now let's just kind of do it elsewhere, and just to say that we can't fully do it elsewhere. Maybe reflect a little bit on some of the impact you've been having. I mean, there's been a startling amount of change. You mentioned AHIP. I know that they've made some announcements in terms of their intention of covering. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of where we are in terms of the necessary alternatives to the unfortunate breakdown of the ACIP process, and how we think it's going to play out in the coming months, particularly around respiratory virus season? I think many people are really worried. I get lots of questions, I'm sure you do, about, can I still get my flu shots? Can I still get my COVID shots?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, let me just say that we're at the beginning of this experience. We're not at the end of it. And we have to keep remembering that. And so we're going to have to pull ourselves together for the long haul. There's at least 3.5 more years of what will likely be real challenges to public health and the information systems that we count on and the recommendation groups. And let me just also just add as a footnote, this is not even just about the United States. We've had extensive contacts with the regulators and government officials in Europe and Asia, in Canada, and they too have, over the years, while functioning as independent government organizations, have looked to and counted on the U.S. for much of the leadership around the recommendations that are made around vaccines. And I'm not just talking about vaccine use, but vaccine prioritization. Where should the research be? What should we be counting on for future vaccines? I think some of you may know our center, CIDRAP, actually is the repository for the both influenza and coronavirus vaccine landscapes and roadmaps. And we actually are working every day to keep those updated as to exactly what research is being done by who, how is it getting funded, and in addition, what are the steps that we need to take to get better flu and coronavirus vaccines. And so I think that this really has long-term implications. Now, in terms of I think what it means in government, one of the things I want to point out that I still worry desperately about the vaccine for children's program, and ones like that are yet likely to be impacted. The vaccine compensation, injury compensation program, I think are still likely to be really changed in a major way by this particular secretary with the support of the administration. And it's clear and evident, again, not a political comment, that Mr. Kennedy enjoys great support from the president. That means he's going to continue to have a license. Let me just lay out, for example, just this past week, in which the ACIP met, as you pointed out. They made some recommendations, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. But the point of it is, right now, there is no one in the senior leadership at CDC, no one in the executive suite who has any scientific experience. Every one of them is an appointed political appointee. Just think of that. Imagine if you had an aircraft carrier and the top 12 people on the aircraft carrier were all political appointed individuals with no expertise in actually driving an aircraft carrier. That would be a real concern, okay? At this point, what it appears is that no one at CDC is actually going to be acting on the recommendations from ACIP a week ago, but rather it's going to go directly to the secretary and he will decide. And frankly, he can decide whatever the hell he wants. And so I worry that even the recommendations we saw come out of ACIP will be somewhat meaningless because if nothing else, they're just a warm-up act. And as we saw what happened with the former appointed director, the Senate confirmed director of CDC, basically resigned or was fired over the fact that she wouldn't rubber stamp the recommendations from Mr. Kennedy. So I think we're still open to this, and I worry that we're going to see some actions in the next week or two from him that will actually go much further in a very negative way with regard to vaccine recommendations. So we're in for a fight of our lifetime. This is not going to end easily. I believe that the agenda will continue to be no vaccines for anyone as basically a premise of where they want to see this go. What we have to never forget is that this is not a political debate as such. This is an issue of life and death for our kids. This is an issue of what are we doing to protect them? And remember, the vast majority of Americans want vaccines for their kids. Yes, there's a very vocal and frankly effective group of individuals that are against the vaccines. But the vast majority, poll after poll, show that we do want to have vaccines for our kids. And so what we have to be really mindful of is that we are acting on behalf of the majority, and we're acting on behalf of good public health that will save lives. And that's going to be a tough battle for the next 3.5 years. So get ready for it now. We have a motto at CIDRAP, and we live by this every day. We will bend and we will bend, but we will not break. We can't break as a country with public health.
Yeah, there's a lot in all of that. I saw polling just this week, I think, very recently done polling that the majority of Americans say they do not trust health information coming out of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And when you play that out to what you just said, which is that in the top executive office of CDC, it's all political appointees that we should extension. To me, I worry that that's part of the point of this, that part of these efforts are truly to dismantle trust and people turning to CDC for information that pushes people. If you can't find information from, trust information coming out of federal government, that leaves you no choice but to really turn to other sources, which, increasingly for people is social media. And there's a whole industry on social media of people making money off of that. Yep. They provide alternative facts and alternative products, and they make a lot of money off of doing that. So this is just kind of, I think, growing the consumer base for those people. But that is a really stunning to me statistic that the majority of Americans say they do not trust information coming from the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I also wanted to point out, though, that it's not just, as you said, it's not just about information. It's not just about giving people alternatives to consider. It's about preventing their access. And what you raised with the Vaccines for Children's program and potentially making changes to vaccine injury compensation program, that will have real consequences for whether people can continue to get the vaccines that they need, the vaccines that they may want. So this isn't about expanding options and giving people, allowing them to do their own research and make their own choices. This is about constraining their choices. This is about taking choices away.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I want to make really clear in this presentation is you cannot trust anything that comes out of CDC today. And that's a very, very painful statement for me to make. Not because of the fact that there aren't incredibly talented, very, very qualified experts at CDC that are still there, but because everything comes through the filter of the political appointees. You don't know, has this been altered? Has this been changed somehow? Has this point of view been put forward contrary to what staff believe that point should be? And so this is a real tragedy because we now realize just how important CDC, and for that matter, the FDA, has been in previous years of providing us with good information. And I think that we have to emphasize the fact that while we don't trust what comes out of CDC, I do trust that it will be an agency that one day will come back to its full glory. And I think if there's anything, I've often believed in life, sometimes you don't miss anything really enough until you don't have it anymore. And then you realize what you took for granted. I think we've taken for granted the public health system that we have in this country and how it's been supported. I worry desperately about state and local health departments. I come from a 25-year history of a state health department experience. And I recognize how funding for much of the infectious disease work and even the chronic disease work comes from CDC to the states. I don't think most people realize that 92 to 94% of the support for most states right now for infectious disease work actually comes from support through CDC. Now, while the recent congressional markup, both the House and the Senate markups, were much, much less severe in terms of cuts, and in fact, in some cases, they added money to the basic HHS budgets. But we don't know how that will play out yet in terms of the White House, because they have already indicated their ability to withhold money, even though, according to law, and I'm not the expert on this, Congress dictates how that money goes. And so I think we're really concerned about the very survival of state and local public health. Without that, you don't have a foundation to build upon for federal and national public health in general. I also want to emphasize the international aspect of this. This is huge. The fact that we're out of WHO, the fact that we basically have done to PEPFAR and USAID what no one could imagine would ever have happened. We are going to see a world that is going to only catch fire more often and more severely with regard to infectious diseases. You know, we spent a lot of time working on those infectious diseases around the world so that we didn't have to deal with them here within our borders. Now, occasionally, some of those infectious agents do make it here. Well, that won't be so occasionally in the future. It's going to be much more compelling about what happens there because, again, we've taken ourselves out of the ability to be interactive there. This is all penny wise, pound foolish. We will pay for this. Absolutely, we will pay for this. And again, my goal is not just around one vaccine, although they're each important. My goal is to see public health restored back to what it once was and can be. And people will realize this. Remember, this is not one of those debates where at the end we'll have a question, well, who won and who lost? Well, everybody loses with this, but more specifically, we will see the rates of disease increasing. We will see more children born with congenital syphilis. We will see more kids dying from measles. We will see thing like this after act this. Imagine right now, and I just have to close on this one because it's just so near and dear to my heart. I've spent almost 45 years of my career working on viral hepatitis, and particularly hepatitis B. And, you know, I remember painfully the 200,000, cases of infection and deaths that occurred in individuals out there in there. And then with a universal vaccine recommendation, that actually was 20,000. We took the 20,000 to less than 200 kids each year in this country born with hepatitis B because of a universal recommendation. People say, well, you shouldn't have to vaccinate newborn kids, test the mothers. Well, our healthcare system is so broken, we couldn't get that done like European countries can. Are we going to go back to all those kids again being infected, becoming chronically infected at high risk for hepatocellular carcinoma? I worry that those are the kind of decisions that we will be paying for many, many years to come.
Well said. I just want to maybe also stress to your points about not being able to trust what's coming out of CDC right now, just how atypical it is for you to say that. You and I have
It's
very
painful.
disagreed with CDC, but I just want to say, am I right to assume that you would have never said that before, that this is an extraordinary departure of, we're not talking about disagreements on facts. We're just talking about it isn't what it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously had my disagreements. I talk about that in the big one. I talk about that in the big one in terms of, I didn't agree with CDC on issues around respiratory protection, but I never once questioned the absolute importance and necessity for the CDC and how they do it. And it was with everything in science. Remember, people confuse what science is. Science is not truth. It's not. Science is the pursuit of truth. And sometimes it takes us a little longer to get to that point than other times, okay? And so I've always seen CDC as the consummate agency to pursue truth. And that's where science comes from. And so, again, I believe very strongly that the importance of the CDC and the FDA every day I'm just reminded of why we needed what we had. And so, yeah, I hope that anyone listening to this will be readily willing to embrace CDC again and state and local health departments when, in fact, it is restored back to its position of scientific authority.
Yeah, you argue both sides until it becomes clear there's no more argument. I mean, that's just what the process is. But right now, we're not even talking about the arguments. We're talking about, curated alternative, curated fantasy is what it feels like more than a process to find truth. I want to look ahead, and you mentioned the big one, and also to maybe just kind of jump off the points you made about how this is not just about the United States. I mean, I was kind of stunned this week to see both the UK Health Security Agency and the WHO have to issue statements about the safety of Tylenol after comments coming out of the United States. And that's just like one small example. I'm sure other countries had to do it too. But clearly what happens in the United States affects health and the practice of public health in other countries. So this clearly is not the United States. But kind of with that framing, I think there's many people who have glad that we're 5 years out of the start of COVID and thinking like, well, we're kind of in a quiet period right now. We're going to be good for a while. But can you talk about the future, what you think is going to come, and what all of these changes will mean for not just the U.S. readiness, but also global readiness for what may be in our future?
Well, let me just put this into perspective, because I surely am not an expert on federal government spending, particularly when it revolves around the Defense Department. But, I've always been struck by the fact, and the Pete Peterson Foundation confirms this, that we actually spend more on defense in this country than the next 10 countries combined, including Russia and China. And so we must be in pretty good shape compared to the rest of the world if we have that kind of expenditures for defense. Maybe not. I don't have the expertise. But I can tell you right now that if you look at the last century, and particularly even 20th century into the 21st century, many, many more people have died from microbes and have died from all aspects of war, as horrible as war is. I would think to myself that, gosh, that's an enemy. I really should have some kind of defense department against that enemy, and I should be investing accordingly. One of the things that I feel very strongly about is the fact of what will happen with future pandemic preparedness. And I can tell you right now, let's just take the example of what happened in the past couple of months, is that if we had an influenza pandemic today, one that could be every bit as devastating, if not more devastating than 1918 or for surely COVID. And if we had to respond quickly, we have the capacity globally right now to make enough influenza vaccine using the imbrated egg as a model and with some cell culture. By the way, the imbrated egg still is a 1950s technology. We could make enough vaccine in the first 12 to 15 months to vaccinate only a quarter of the world. That's it. Now, mRNA technology comes along, and while it is a good vaccine, we both know that influenza and COVID vaccines are good vaccines. They're not great. You still can get infected, you can still transmit, but they do a tremendous job of reducing serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. I'll take that any time of the day as an outcome for getting a vaccine. So I strongly support the use of these vaccines. But the bottom line is we could, I believe, make better vaccines. That would be great. But in the meantime, what can I do about influenza vaccine availability? Well, if we had mRNA technology, our best guesstimate is we could make enough vaccine in the first year of the pandemic to actually vaccinate the whole world. Do you know what the difference between that scenario of having only a quarter of the world vaccinated in the first 12 to 15 months versus a whole world vaccinated in the first year? That's millions and millions and millions of lives. Well, guess what? We had $500 million invested in mRNA technology research for influenza vaccines that just got pulled. And it was transferred, or at least in part, the money was moved to the NIH to actually work on a vaccine candidate that happens to be the favorite of somebody who's now an appointed member of the leadership at NIH, for which we have data for the last 40 years showing that technology has not yet ever been successful, a whole cell vaccine. So I'm sitting here saying to myself, what can we do for the future that would make a difference? One, if we had one less aircraft carrier, which I know is nonsensical because I don't know what I'm talking about, but I do know it takes 12 to 14 years to build an aircraft carrier. And once they start that process at day one, they plan on funding that for 14 years and getting it done and getting it out. What if we did that with our vaccine technologies today for influenza and coronaviruses? I believe in my heart of hearts that we can make much better vaccines down the road and invest. Think about taking pandemics off the table. We can't do that now, but we could one day. So I think one of the things we have to look forward to in the future is, in fact, solutions. And they're going to mean we have to come to a new recognition of just what microbes do to us. Again, when I talk to the public and say, do you realize that many, many more people have died from infectious diseases than have died from all the wars? And they say, oh, no. And I think once people recognize that, this common sense, why not invest in taking these off the table? And unfortunately, we're going to have a lot of work to do in the course of whatever the next administration might be that's favorable to USAID, to PEPFAR. I just have to say, my heart breaks My heart breaks to see what's happening right now for all those individuals who received antiretroviral drugs because of the soft diplomacy, the goodness of the United States government. Now to change that to the extent that we are, I think is just devastating. And I never thought, back in the mid 1980s, I was very involved with HIV/AIDS work. And, there were times I would go up to 5 funerals a week for HIV, never ever wanting to know that again. And you know what? There's going to be parts of the world where that's not going to be even the worst of experiences in the future. So let me just say there is much we can do, but we have to have a recognition of what has been undone and what it would take to not only rebuild that, but then to basically dream forward to what we also could do to take some of these scourges away from our society.
And maybe just because we're talking about defense looking forward, and I'm going to then, after this question, turn to, I see some folks are putting questions in the Q&A box, and please do feel free to do that. Just to also say that natural pandemics are just one of the scenarios that we want to defend against, but there is also the possibility of a deliberate attack using biological weapons. And for a very long time, part of the bipartisan support for these approaches has been in recognition of having protections, and vaccine plans ready to go or one form of protection is a deterrent. If it can't hurt us, why do it? But we're losing the deterrence aspect of this in basically selling off the equivalent of our aircraft carriers.
Yeah. Well, let me first of all just start out by saying that, again, this is not a comment on any individual. My comment is during the first Trump administration, there was actually plans put in place, and there was a lot of work that was done on biopreparedness. So that was okay then. Look at the whole vaccine program came out of Operation Warp Speed, again, an administration program. So it's not that administration has always been anti-vaccine or anti-public health. Now, grant you that COVID surely caused challenges. Now we're in a different place, though. Do you realize that there is no one right now in the White House that has any expertise in biopreparedness, or for that matter, in the Security Council? And I know Beth Cameron is online with us today here at your center, one of my heroes in all this business, somebody I've learned a lot from. I can't even imagine, Beth, what it's like for you to see what you once had and what you built in such an important way in the White House. So right now, if we had a major event, who the hell is in charge of anything relative to any experience at the government level, meaning at the White House level, or for that matter, everyone at CDC right now in the senior leadership is a political appointee, not a scientist expert. They don't even confer with the scientific experts within CDC. So I think our preparedness right now is not only back to zero, it's minus. And I think that this is a challenge. So I want to echo what you just said. And, if I were a enemy of the United States and I wanted to consider using a bioweapon, and even if I'm a lone offender or for that matter, some kind of terrorist organization, right now, we are the most vulnerable we've ever been. I mean, we were not this vulnerable back in the 80s and 90s. And so I think that one of the things we have to recognize, again, is what you just said. We have to be prepared for these big events. You may not like having bad hurricanes happen, but they happen. You may not like pandemics happening, but they happen. And I think that one of the things that we need to be prepared for is just that. And right now, there is no emphasis, zero zip, no emphasis within our federal government really to bring us together as a community. And let me just say one last thing, and Jennifer, you know this because you were also involved with this, but there were a number of us that really hoped, and I know hope's not a strategy, but we hoped that in fact the US government would embark upon a post 9/11 like review of what happened with COVID. I was fortunate to be in the early days of the 9/11 bipartisan by the commission to look at what happened. And it was remarkable between Tom Keene and Lee Hamilton, two very distinguished previous elected officials who handled that without partisanship, who basically looked at what were the failures, what could we have learned from it, how did we respond? What could we do better to respond in the future? Wouldn't it have been wonderful if we could have had the same kind of nonpartisan review of COVID so that we had lessons learned for the future? And I think in the end, I tried to do some of that in the book that we wrote, the big one. But really, it's something that we will pay a big price for not having learned from. And I wish that were the case today.
And much of the U.S. many aspects of the U.S. preparedness infrastructure actually came out of legislation from that post 9/11 commission effort, recognizing that the United States was vulnerable to attack 25, nearly 25 years ago, and never again. And just feels like we lost more than 1 million Americans in COVID. And
we did.
I do have to say, I think some people, when they hear us talk about these preparations, in their minds, it is equivalent to what happened in early COVID, where we shut things down. We told people they couldn't do the stuff that they cared about. And so for them, public health preparedness may be equivalent with keeping your kids out of schools, shutting down businesses, forcing you to do things you may not want to do, like take a vaccine that you're not quite convinced of and wear a mask. What do you say to the people who like fear that when we're talking about these programs that are necessary and the efforts that are necessary, that's what we're pushing for?
One of the things I try to do in the book is revisit revisionist history of COVID, okay? Because there are a lot of people right now who are making statements about what happened that simply are not true. Let me just give you a case in point. Lockdowns, whatever the hell that means, okay? But in fact, in the earliest days of the pandemic, I wrote actually a piece in early March of 2020 saying, and I did this in the Washington Post, saying, do not lockdowns. Don't do them. They won't work. Why? Because this isn't a hurricane where for 16 hours you're going to get pummeled and then you can go in recovery. This is going to last likely years. Are you prepared to spend years basically in a lockdown kind of mode? And of course, no. And so my suggestion was do snow days, meaning that the most important thing to save lives in the earliest days of the pandemic was to have adequate medical care. And when your healthcare facility was at 140% census, I'm telling you, you're not getting good medical care. And so could we use snow days to say we're now at 95% capacity? Please, for the next 2 or 3 weeks, okay, avoid public spaces if you can. Now schools might want to close. That type of thing, and then get that number back down and kind of ride the wave, including when the surges occur, trying to minimize the number of people who got infected. Because remember, if you die in the first 6 months or the second 6 months or the third 6 months or the fourth 6 months, you're still pretty dead at the end of the pandemic. And that's what exactly happened in parts of China, where for 2 years they locked down pretty tight, food being delivered to homes, but they didn't vaccinate. And then they released the people, and then they had a major increase in the number of deaths in China. And so I think that was an important message. Lockdowns really as such weren't right. But more importantly, lockdowns were totally misinterpreted. There were 41 states that in that period, basically of March to June, early June, had some kind of government directive in place about what people could do publicly. But let me just give you an example, Minnesota. Our governor basically issued a stay-at-home order, except for those who were essential workers. 82% of our workforce was deemed essential workers. Now, come on, was that a lockdown? No, of course not. And all of the lockdowns, with except one state, ended by early June. Remember, the pandemic went on for 3.5 more years. The economic impact wasn't about lockdowns. It was about how people were responding in fear to this virus. People didn't want to get together. People didn't want to be together. And I would even go so far as to say the school issue for me was a challenge. Because if you look, almost 1,570 kids died from COVID in the first 3 years of the pandemic. Only 100, and I say only with pain, 199 died in the first year. 87% of the kids died in year 2 and 3, which was when the new variants, both Delta and Omicron, showed up. And yet the recommendations we were making came from year 1, when in fact there was less evidence of severe illness in these kids. We didn't adjust to that. We didn't communicate. And then a very wonderfully well done study out of Boston showed that about 70% of all the transmission in households occurred as a result of a child bringing the virus home from school in year 2 and 3 of the pandemic. So one of the things I think we need to go back and look at are, so what would those recommendations be? Don't do a lockdown. do snow days, and try to keep as many people alive with good medical care, because in the end, most people are going to get infected, no matter how hard you try. We could have done much more in respiratory protection. Hygiene theater was a joke. It was a tragic joke where people thought being behind a plexiglass shield protected you, where those aerosols were just moving around and about. So I think there's a lot that we can still learn for future pandemics that can make our response, a much more effective response. And I just last one, because I know you've commented on this before, Jennifer, yourself, is, border closings when you have a virus with wings, like a flu or a coronavirus, they're going to spread. I mean, here we were, falsely locking down our West Coast against that virus coming from China. And then it came through China to Italy to the United States. And look what happened on the East Coast. We were totally caught by surprise on that. And so I think that one of the things we also have to recognize, once that virus is out, it's gone. We have to be prepared to respond at all of our borders and everything inside our country.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's so much we have to learn, but I think the goal for me is pushing to a state of preparedness such that when these events happen, they don't mean we have to give up or stop doing the things we care about, that we have the tools to continue to do those things safely. So we're not making choices between gathering with loved ones and risking deadly infections. And I think that's absolutely possible and doable, but it just takes work and effort. And we have 15 minutes left, and we have a bunch of questions. One thing I want to make sure to get to in terms of the questions that have been asked. People are wondering, what can we do? One question is, we got some questions submitted in advance of this session, but there are a bunch of questions on this. I'll just read part of the question that's in the Q&A box. It said, in the era where public health folks are losing their jobs, but we still want to work to support strong public health work, what recommendations do you have? I want to make sure we get your thoughts on this, because I think people could leave this being quite demoralized and sort of wondering, if it's hopeless or if there's a possibility.
Well, I think, first of all, it's a sad commentary that we do see people who've lost jobs, who are those people that in the past were I guess I would call the angels of our public health world, who are out there on the front lines doing the kind of work that saved lives, that improved quality of life. And I don't for a minute want to minimize the pain that they're going through in terms of what's happened with their positions, and even to the extent of the kind of abuse that they take far too often, and the kind of emails and calls and comments that get made. That's hard. And of course, as we know, even threatening in some cases. But I think that one of the things we've tried to do with the Vaccine Integrity Group is show that you can do something, okay? It may not be conventional. It may not be in a setting where it's going to have national implications. But how many events are occurring at your local school boards right now? School board meetings often are very critical in deciding what happens with vaccines. What is the health department's activities in a given area, and can you help volunteer? And in fact, on my podcast several weeks ago, I actually published a list of places that are vaccine promotion organizations that are always looking for volunteers to help. Okay, try to get yourself into those kinds of environments to help out. And I am clearly part of a group that's really pushing our philanthropic communities to help support the kinds of work that traditionally they would never touch. But in fact, now we need them. And what can be done? Even organizing around state and local governments to make sure that any laws passed are in fact consistent with and supportive of good public health. We're seeing some states, Colorado was the first out of the chute to change their laws so that they could, in fact, allow vaccines to be paid for that were not necessarily recommended or recommended against by ACIP. I think anything you can do to get involved with these organizations and to look at what they're doing and how does that fit with you. That's not a job necessarily. And of course, right now, people need incomes. And I hope we can surely use the philanthropic world to help support more work where you do get paid. But in the meantime, just be involved and don't give up. You can't give up. As I said earlier, we will bend and we will bend, but we will not break. We got to see this through to the end. And, I have to say that many people would probably chuckle if they heard me describe my book, because I believe it's a love story. And it's a love story because it's about my grandkids. And as I sit here right now on this screen, my eye is slightly distracted to the right side here, where my kids some years ago gave me an electronic picture frame. And every 30 seconds, a new shot of one or more of my grandkids appears on that screen. And I'm telling you, I don't need any more reminding of why I'm doing what I'm doing right now. It's not about me. It's about what I care about for my kids and grandkids and the love of those. And so I hope that some of you can find in your own hearts the fact that this is about your kids and grandkids, and it's not about us. And hopefully that will help incentivize you, motivate you, and to do what you can to help out in your local community or wherever it is that you might be able to add your expertise.
Oh, very well said. I would just add, there's a reason why public health as a field has been established. There's a reason why we, work to amass that body of knowledge and create the programs and the infrastructure and the agencies that exist. I really hate that we have to rediscover the why, but we will rediscover the why. And when that happens, we need to make sure we have that pipeline of talent and expertise and passion that's ready to go. So I very much hope that if anyone's listening to this, they don't think, oh, and now is not a time to continue to study public health or to go into public health. Like, we will need your brain. So please don't be deterred. There's many ways to work in this field.
Can I just offer something there, because this is another example. Our center has worked with several foundations that traditionally in the past have never done this. But we've asked them and said, do you realize that with funding cuts so significant, we have a number of PhD students that are literally going to be held dry in the middle of their research, possibly never getting that research reestablished and not getting their degree despite how much work they've done. We now have a series of scholarships at our center that are based solely on support from these foundations as scholars. And with something they'd never done before, but was so critical in terms of trying to keep people's research moving and going forward, because that's a generational issue, as you've pointed out. If we lose that group of current students, of our current, they're our leaders of tomorrow, they're our future, and we need them badly. So they're, again, working with local foundations to help support graduate education right now in public health is another opportunity to do something different, to make a difference.
That's really encouraging and inspiring to hear. It's so important. Mike, maybe we'll see if we have time for another one, but I do want to ask this question, which is that in your book, you wrote that if skeptics of established science are placed in positions of government leadership and allowed to appoint like-minded people to critical positions such as the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice, the already fragile trust in science will be further eroded. First of all, you obviously had some expertise and insights into, the future that we're now living. But the question to you is, given that worry of yours has since become true, there are many questions that we've gotten about, like, how do we speak to the erosion of trust in science and impacts? I might actually rephrase that, and just because I'm not sure, and I'm curious of your thought, if science trust has eroded, at least on the public polling I see, it's actually quite high. I do think that trust in government has eroded, particularly agencies. But anyway, what do you think about that?
Well, this is an area that, two things. First of all, it requires a heck of a lot of humility. I think we just have to acknowledge we don't know a lot about what it is that is motivating people to feel how they feel or what they feel about it. I'm struck by the fact that people look at vaccines and they think to themselves, well, it's about human behavior, et cetera. Well, guess what? We're seeing more and more veterinarians reporting that their human owners of dogs and cats are refusing to vaccinate them for rabies because they want to decide which vaccines their animals should get. This isn't even about kids. This is about their pets. And I think that what we don't understand, and this is where we're trying to dig in on the social media research side, what is it that is changing people's views, and what are those views? And, at what point, as I made a comment earlier about most Americans still support vaccines, what is it that we need to continue to support to keep those on board that are there, but also then how do we address those that aren't? And, I had the very, very painful experience during the COVID pandemic of three dear friends and colleagues who I have worked with, known, loved for many, many years, who literally ended our friendships because of the fact that I continued to urge them to be vaccinated. All three of those individuals throughout the pandemic eventually acquired COVID, and all three died. I struggled. What the hell could I have done differently? Why? Why did this happen? And I think that we don't have a lot of the answers. So, I mean, if there's anything, this is a very rich area for research that we need to get to understand just the point that you made, because I think you're exactly right on your point. And we have a lot of work to do yet. And all I can say is acknowledge that, embrace it, and then begin to figure out, okay, how do I learn from this? And one of the things I'll tell you right now, and it's been, I like to think that I have done this in the past. My kids would probably tell you it wasn't true, but I have learned the whole new art of listening and understanding where people are coming from, because it's only with that do you really begin to understand then how can I do something to change that outcome?
Yeah, and I think that it's key that we do that research because, I mean, at least when you look at the polling, we see high support for vaccines. We see the majority of Americans want more scientific research, more biomedical research, not less. There are some key points in which we disagree as a country, and I think policies around COVID and COVID vaccines are a place where we do see some disagreement, but it doesn't mean that we're hopelessly divided or that the American public doesn't support public health.
Yeah.
Even if people are trying to assert that as justification to try to erode public health, at least the data that we have now suggests that that's not going to be successful. Or at least it's not aligned with the will of the American people. So, but we do need to understand people's views because it is public health, and we can't do things that are at odds with what the public wants. We either have to talk to them and try to help them understand why it could be beneficial, but we can't force people to do things that they don't think is in their best interest. That's a very
Anyway, can I just add one last point to that? That's why centers like yours are so important too, because you're in the position to understand the need for that research and to be able to tie together all the different aspects of it and to come back with answers to questions that we desperately need to have answered. So I just want to commend you and your colleagues at your center for that kind of approach and answering those questions.
So rapid fire question for you. You said, we're gonna we are gonna get to a point where we're gonna rebuild all this. And I hope when we get to that point as a country, you are tapped to lead those efforts. Maybe just in a minute or two, what's your first priority action in terms of rebuilding?
Well, first of all, let me say that it's probably not the obvious answer. I work with a number of individuals today that are what I would call the young, upcoming future of public health. And if I were 20 years younger and they might be 15 or 20 years older, I'm sure I'd be working for them. And so I think my most important aspect right now is to continue to support those individuals in their careers because they will be the leaders of tomorrow. I'll be gone. I'll be long gone. And I think that that's really a critical piece, is to make sure that we have those leaders in the pipeline and that we don't suddenly hit a space of 10 or 15 years where they just didn't exist. So that's number one. Number two is I think it's all about, this should not be partisan. And I know that sounds naive to many, and I don't mean to be naive, but we should keep emphasizing the points that we can agree on that are not partisan. And how can we support that? We keep talking about security in this country. We keep talking about the enemies from without. Well, the microbes are both without and within. And what can we do to deal with those? And I think we need to keep pushing that agenda forward. I think we need to keep pushing forward the agenda on the potential catastrophic events, which, while they may not occur often, when they occur, they redefine history. So I think that's the kind of thing that, message-wise, we should all be in this together. This is us versus the microbes. Shouldn't be us versus us. Oh, and by the way, microbes are going to kill a bunch of you. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. It was incredibly helpful. And I'd like to offer my sincerest thanks to you, not only for joining us today and helping
Thank
us
you.
kind of make sense of what's happening and what's to come, but also your continued leadership on these issues. I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today,
Thank you.
this discussion, and give particular thanks to our team at the Pandemic Center to help put this event together. Bentley Holt, Michael Mitchell, Leah Levgren, Amanda Kogan, Carly Gasca, Aaron Johnson, Andrea Ulig, Ann Wang, Alice Im, and Margaret Dunn. To stay up to date on future sessions, use the QR code on the screen to access our link tree. There you can sign up for our webinar mailing list, catch up on past recordings, and explore other resources like our weekly tracking report, which includes updates on topics like measles, flu, and many, many other global outbreaks. Recording of today's session will be available on the events page of our website next week, along with previous webinars. And please follow us on social media for updates. Feel free to reach out with any questions or suggestions of your future webinar topics. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, thank you. We are adjourned. Be safe, be healthy, and stay engaged.